higher, farther, faster, to go where no one has gone before. These goals have propelled humanity to the limits of our ingenuity, inspiring us to transcend the bounds of Earth and within the span of a single lifetime, venture into the limitless frontiers of outer space. From supersonic jets made of tons of advanced electronics and space-age composites, to modern ultralights made of a few dozen pounds of framing spanned by gossamer cloth, aviators, designers, and engineers have advanced the horizons of flight in extraordinary leaps and bounds. From the first flights of the Wright brothers to the around-the-world journey of Dick and Bert Rutan's revolutionary Voyager. Though separated by decades, these two pair of pioneering brothers shared a common passion and purpose found throughout the history of flight. Along with countless others, their foresights, ingenuity, and courage have helped to forge the wings of man. Since the dawn of human history, our desire to fly like the birds has been expressed in myth and legend. These dreams began to take practical form in the 15th century, when Leonardo Da Vinci's visionary efforts produced several ingenious but ultimately unsuccessful designs for heavier-than-air flying machines. In the following centuries, flight in lighter-than-air balloons was successfully accomplished. Working scale models of flying machines were also produced, as were man-carrying gliders. However, until the 20th century, all the attempts by would-be aviators to achieve a sustained, man-controlled flight in a powered, heavier-than-air machine had ended in failure. For a pair of inventive brothers from Dayton, Ohio, history was certainly not on their side. As boys, Wilbur Wright and younger brother Orville had built model airplanes based on the designs of earlier trailblazers, Sir George Cayley and Alphonse Pinot, a Frenchman well known for his mechanical helicopters. Even as they later established themselves as successful owners of a printing company and designers and builders of bicycles, their interest in flying never waned.
It was there just kind of smoldering for many years. Finally, in about 1896, Wilbur Wright realized that his mind was not being adequately challenged in the bicycle business. He was looking for something.
In 1899, the Wrights wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., asking for all the information that was available about the experiments of previous aviation pioneers. After carefully analyzing the few successes and many failures of inventors before them, the Wright brothers soon began to develop their own ideas about flying. In contrast to many earlier would-be aviators who took a mainly instinctive approach to achieving flight, they decided to tackle the problem logically and in stages.
The Wrights' approach was that they were going to crawl before they walked, walk before they ran, and ran before they leaped. Their father had taught them from the year one to read and self-educate whenever they needed to know something. They had education in physics and trigonometry through high school, which they used fluently. And again, they had tremendous assets from their parents, their father being a bishop in the United Brethren Church and a very well-educated man, and their mother having gone to college majoring in mathematics, Greek, and science, and also being an excellent person working with her hands with excellent mechanical abilities.
One of their first goals was to discover a wing design that was efficient and controllable in flight.
Orville developed a very unique way for testing airframes. He took a regular bicycle, and on the front of it, he mounted the wheel from another bicycle. And then on that wheel, he would mount the model of a wing. So you'd have a regular bicycle, this horizontal wheel sticking out in front of it that was free to turn and rotate, and then rising from it, the model of a wing. Wilbur and then Orville would ride up and down the streets here in West Dayton as fast as possible. The idea being that if that model, if that wing was performing the way that it should, that wheel out in front would not turn.
In 1901, the brothers built one of the first wind tunnels in the United States to allow more advanced testing on various wing designs. Although the data generated by this pioneering device allowed the Wrights to produce wings far more efficient than their contemporaries, perhaps their most important advance was the system they developed to control their craft in flight.
They recognized that flying was a very unstable thing, and consequently that you had to control an airplane in 3 axes. You had to control a plane in what we call pitch, like this. You had to control a plane in yaw, this way. You had to control an airplane in what we call roll. It is a very difficult thing that has to be done, and they recognized the need for this 3-directional control. They noticed that birds were turning and twisting the tips of their wings. And one day in the bicycle shop, Wilbur was taking an inner tube out of a box. Now, I have painted this box to kind of look like a Wright biplane from the front, with a red wing on top and a black wing on the bottom. And he started twisting this box, and all of a sudden he realized if he did something like this, he would twist it up, and this upper wing would expose the tip of the outboard left wing, and this lower wing would expose the tip of the outboard right wing. When this wing was exposed to the wind would push down on it, and when this bottom wing was exposed to the wind would push up on it. So they had a turning force that gave the most leverage with the force right out at the tips of the wings.
The Wrights called their system wing warping, but they needed a way to test the idea.
What they did is that they went out and built a kite. And they flew a kite. And they had 4 wires on this kite. And by manipulating these wires, they could control that kite in pitch, and they could control it in roll. And so they recognized that they had an idea there. Then and only then is when they decided to take the next step, a glider.
After extensive research to discover a location that would provide the necessary wind conditions, the Wrights tested their gliders at Kill Devil Hills, approximately 4 miles south of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Here they made hundreds of flights. The system they developed to implement the wing warping concept on these gliders was unique.
They did their wing warping with a hip cradle where they did the hula hula with the thing to make the wing warping. So Wilbur said, let's tie the rudder mechanism into the wing warp so that when we do the wing warp, we'll also turn the rudder at the same time. And with that invention, they had the problem of 3-directional control solved. And you know, our basic control system that we use on our general aviation and many of our aircraft today is based on that same concept that the Wright brothers designed in 1902.
After the success of their 1902 glider, the Wrights decided they were ready to apply their design to a powered craft. Unable to secure an available engine from U.S. manufacturers that was both light and powerful enough for their needs, they realized they'd have to build their own. Fortunately, they didn't have to look far for the right man to do the job. They turned to Charlie Taylor, the chief repairman in their bicycle shop back in Dayton.
Charlie was the one that really was the hero for Orville and Wilbur Wright to be able to build an engine at the horsepower they needed and the weight that they needed. Weight to horsepower was the key to flight. In other words, you have to have so many pounds of thrust to get an airplane into the air, but the weight of that thrust must be reduced.
Keep in mind that most of the riding lawnmowers you see in operation today have engines that produce more horsepower than the engine on the world's first airplane.
The 150-pound, 12-horsepower water-cooled gasoline engine also met the important criteria of being relatively vibration-free, so as not to jeopardize the aircraft's delicate construction. Finally, in 1903, after designing and building their own propellers, the Wrights were ready to assemble their flying machine. It was called the Flyer. With its wingspan of 40 feet, length of 21 feet, and weight of 750 pounds, the Wright brothers' flyer was a relatively modest-sized aircraft. In addition to its unique engine and control system, it featured a lightweight airframe made of ash and spruce, and wings covered with muslin. The entire plane, including the thousands of stitches required to attach the wing fabric, was assembled by the Wrights themselves.
This sewing machine belonged to the Wrights, and Orville and Wilbur actually stitched the material themselves on the sewing machine. They were just very cautious, very careful, and knew that they needed this to be as strong as possible, so they did all of the stitching.
They attached the cloth to the flyer in a unique way that greatly strengthened their craft.
They applied the muslin at an angle, which gives the wing and the fabric much greater strength than it would have had otherwise. They did not put any doping or treating of the fabric, partly because they did not want to add the extra weight.
The Wrights also mounted a front elevator on the aircraft to control climb and descent, and a wire pulley mechanism similar to the ones in their gliders to warp the wings to govern lateral movement. The plane had no wheels, only rollers that allowed it to build speed on takeoff from a ground-mounted wooden rail. The most innovative flying machine of its day, the flyer was the unique and total invention of the Wright brothers.
Part of it was native ability. Wilbur was described by many as the one that would come up with the ideas, the concepts. Orville, on the other hand, was described as the one that would find a way of taking that idea and turning it into a reality. Together, it was a perfect combination.
Many of the constant challenges faced by the Wrights were the purely physical demands of learning to control their craft in test after test.
One of their skills was their athletic ability. They had very good coordination. Orville in particular was a bicycle racer. They had the skills of a scientist, an engineer, a mechanic, and an athlete. Each one of these wrapped up into one person, but not only one, but two, working together in synergism.
On the morning of December 14th, 1903, at Kill Devil Hills, after over 7 years of painstaking research, manufacturing, and testing, the Wright brothers were finally ready to put their flyer to the test. Wilbur and Orville tossed a coin to see who would go first, and the older brother, 36-year-old Wilbur, won. But an error in control resulted in an abrupt crash, damaging the fragile machine. 3 days later, on December 17th, they were ready to try again, this time with Orville at the controls. With Wilbur running alongside, the flyer moved down the launching rail and slowly lifted into the air. It flew for 120 feet until it gently touched down. With this first tenuous airborne journey, the Wright brothers had achieved something that had eluded humankind for thousands of years. They had achieved a sustained, man-controlled flight in a powered, heavier-than-air flying machine. Although the desire for secrecy meant there were few spectators on hand to vouch for this accomplishment, the brothers had set John Daniel, one of the men who worked at the weather station, to be ready to take a photograph if the flyer left the ground. Legend has it that Daniel was so excited when they did indeed leave the ground, he said, "Damned if he ain't flew," and was unsure he'd snap the shutter at the right time. They didn't know until they'd returned to Dayton and developed the negatives that they had indeed captured their triumphant moment. The Wright brothers flew 3 more times that blustery December day, with the flyer accomplishing its longest flight on the final run, soaring over 850 feet while remaining in the air for an astounding 59 seconds. That evening, a joyous Orville sent a telegram to his father Milton back in Ohio, which actually shortchanged their longest flight by 2 seconds. Success. 4 flights Thursday morning, all against 21-mile wind. Started from level with engine power alone. Speed through air, 31 miles. Longest, 57 seconds. Informed press. Home Christmas. despite their photograph and efforts by the Wright family to spread the news. Only a handful of American newspapers ran stories the next day about the Wrights' accomplishment. With a number of recent high-profile failures by other inventors still fresh in their minds, the editors were skeptical of the whole notion of powered flight, viewing the Wrights as simply another in a long line of self-promoting eccentrics. To make matters worse, the flyer was unable to repeat its performance.
After they brought the plane back to the camp, the wind caught it, turned it end over end like a tumbleweed, broke it all to pieces, and their experimentation was done for the year.
But the Wright brothers and their revolutionary machine had indeed done what no one had ever done before. They had flown in sustained, powered flight. Now, with proud determination, they realized that the flyer's success at Kitty Hawk was not to be the culmination of their efforts. It was just the beginning. When the Wrights returned to Dayton from Kitty Hawk in 1903, there was little fanfare. In fact, the local paper didn't even mention their accomplishment. They immediately returned to work on a new and improved flyer. It was completed a year later, and they began conducting test flights on a large plot of land on the outskirts of Dayton known as Huffman Prairie. The initial results were disappointing.
They had a lot of trouble getting it off the ground because the density in the air in Dayton, Ohio in the summer was a lot different than the density of the air at Kitty Hawk in the winter. In fact, it lost about 13% of their lift as a result of this. So they had to have longer takeoffs.
To solve this problem, the Wrights developed a simple catapult system that used a falling weight to propel their craft into the air.
With the 1904 flyer, they got very few minutes of flying time that year, but they got the catapult working. So in 1905, they built a whole new airplane, and it was flying all right. But still, they were having problems with controlling it in a turn. And so they lengthened the airplane mid-year, and then all of a sudden, they started improving.
After this, the Wrights' progress was rapid and steady.
At Kitty Hawk, Wilbur and Orville make flight possible. At Huffman Prairie Flying Field in 1904 and 1905, Wilbur and Orville make flight practical. And there's a big difference. At Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903, they will make 4 flights, all of which are in a straight line. At Huffman Prairie Flying Field, these two will actually learn to control and maneuver that powered machine in the sky.
On May 22, 1906, confident and secure in their success, the Wrights finally patented their flying machine. But it appeared the world was still not ready for their breakthrough. It wasn't until 1908, 5 years after their first triumphant flight, that the American government finally took notice. An enhanced version of the 1905 flyer could easily meet the U.S. Signal Corps criteria of soaring 40 miles an hour for a minimum of 1 hour. With their machine demonstrating an impressive capacity not only for speed and duration, but distance and altitude as well, the brothers were offered a government contract for a 2-seat airplane. However, American officials still viewed flight as something of a curiosity and raised no objections when the Wrights also struck a deal overseas.
Wilbur and Orville were actually able to sell their concept of flight to a syndicate in France, which was then going to turn around, manufacture airplanes, and sell them to the French government. As part of that deal, the Wrights agreed to conduct several demonstration flights. Prior to this time, everyone in France that was flying were making very broad, flat turns. Wilbur takes to the sky in August 1908. He's making very sharp bank turns. And it's clear to all of the experts in flight who were on hand at the time that here were the true masters of the sky.
The Wrights were hailed as heroes at home and abroad. Yet despite their long overdue success, they would soon encounter more than their share of setbacks. While Wilbur was trailblazing in France, Orville was giving flying demonstrations to the Army in Fort Myer, Virginia. During one of these flights, a propeller malfunction caused the plane to crash, killing his passenger, Army Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, and seriously injuring Orville. A further problem during this period was the Wrights' need to engage in extensive patent litigation. They'd filed a series of lawsuits against aircraft builders such as Glenn Curtiss over infringements of what they believed were their proprietary inventions. Nevertheless, the brothers continued building more advanced airplanes, including the Wright B Flyer, and even founded their own airplane manufacturing corporation. They also began construction on their beautiful new family home in Dayton. A classic and elegant design produced by Orville himself, the Wrights named it Hawthorne Hill. But the ongoing wrangling over their patent in the courts took its toll. In 1912, weakened by the constant strain, Wilbur succumbed to typhoid fever at the age of 45. He would never set foot in his new home. Orville was deeply affected by the loss of his brother. Without him, he seemed to have no desire to pursue further developments in flight. Eventually, he and his lawyers were able to win their lawsuits, and the Wright family made substantial earnings from their patent design.
They will become wealthy, but they will not become the super wealthy of the time period. When Orville dies in 1948, his estate is valued at a little over $1 million. Certainly a lot of money for the time period, but nowhere compared to families like the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies. Part of it is that these two never claimed to be very good in business. And part of it is that they went into the idea of flight not because of the idea of fame, fortune, or glory, but because of the challenge that the question represented.
The Wright brothers met this challenge head-on and then attacked it from every angle. As scientists, mathematicians, builders, mechanics, and test pilots. Even today, as historians and flight aficionados prepare to celebrate the approaching 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk, with exhibits and expositions across the country, they're recognizing the extraordinary inventiveness that went into designing the original 1903 Flyer. Over the years, though many attempts have been made to produce an exact flying replica of the powered aircraft, they've all been unsuccessful. Perhaps in part because the original was gradually developed, carefully handcrafted and engineered through test after test, piloted by its inventors, tailored to Wilbur's and Orville's individual physical characteristics and abilities. Today, throughout the world, in anticipation of the 100th anniversary of flight, attempts are underway to build exact replicas of the 1903 Flyer, to study and somehow better understand how one of the greatest technological advances in the history of man was accomplished.
The real genius of these two was their ability to challenge every assumption and to find a way of testing every single step of the process. That's what really set these two apart and allowed them to succeed where all of their competitors were coming up short. Think of it this way. Wilbur and Orville's very first flight lasts 12 seconds. It travels 120 feet. Since then, we have traveled to the moon and back. And today we have a machine that can travel at 28.5 times the speed of sound. And all of it begins with two bicycle mechanics in a small shop in Dayton, Ohio.
The Wright brothers' milestone thrust open the door to new adventurers and pioneers of flight around the world, including two brothers today who possess this same indomitable spirit. The Mojave Desert in California has been the location for some of the most significant advances in the history of flight. It was here at Edwards Air Force Base, beginning in the late 1940s, that scores of aviation records were set and shattered. And it was at the small nearby town of Mojave in the 1980s that the quest began to set another milestone, one that would see human beings fly farther, nonstop, than they ever had before. It began one afternoon in 1980 when Dick Rutan, a highly skilled former combat and test pilot, was talking with his younger brother, Bert, a renowned aircraft designer, along with close friend Gina Yeager. They wondered if it was possible to achieve what many believed was the last great aviation milestone, flying around the world nonstop without refueling.
He says, yeah, with carbon fiber and a special design airplane, I think it's possible. And from that moment on, that idea just became so infectious, it just grabbed my soul.
Bert Rutan was uniquely suited to design such a plane. In the early 1970s, he had specialized in building aircraft that exploited a control feature called a canard, a nose-mounted pair of winglets that made a conventional tail unnecessary. This feature, also sometimes called a forward elevator, was in many ways similar to that successfully employed by the Wright brothers in 1903, and was essential to providing additional lift and improving the plane's efficiency, stability, and range. In his career, Burt has designed over 20 highly innovative aircraft, including the Proteus, a high-altitude plane for commercial communications and other applications. Like many of his designs, Proteus depends on the use of composite materials in its construction. Composites are synthetic materials, featuring two or more distinct, structurally complementary substances.
Well, composites have revolutionized aircraft manufacturing. Not only do they allow you to make an airplane with fewer parts, which goes to the cost of manufacturing an airplane, but they also allow you to make the airplane lighter because composites tend to be, pound for pound, stronger than steel or other metal-type materials.
Like the Wright brothers over 3/4 of a century earlier, the Britanns knew their extraordinary aircraft would have to be literally handmade, piece by piece. Burt would be utilizing both composites and canards in his design for an aircraft that could safely achieve what had never been done before. Once the basic design was complete, he, Dick, and Gina, and a dedicated group of volunteers, began working around the clock to build the revolutionary aircraft, acquiring the necessary components through whatever means possible.
We scrounged everything we could. The people that would come and work on the program, mostly volunteers, they would come and be excited and they would lend their labor.
During the entire construction period, Burt fine-tuned the design, often right on the spot.
He designed it just as we needed it. He would make little sketches of what particular thing we had to do.
The carbon fiber they decided upon was 5 times stronger than steel and approximately 1/2 the weight. They needed this strength to support the tremendous amount of fuel the 25,000-mile flight would require. Ultimately, of the plane's total weight of more than 9,000 pounds, over 75%, approximately 7,000 pounds, would consist of fuel.
The airplane was actually a flying fuel tank. It's not that we built fuel tanks and installed them in the airplane. Since composite construction is just 2 skins, we built the bottom skin in the shape of the airfoil on the bottom, and we built the one on the top, and then the spar in the center, and when we glued them together, we sectioned them off for about, I think the main wings had about 4 or 5 fuel sections, and we run a tube to each one of them and a vent line to the other one.
The fact that the plane would have to be filled with fuel and little else made it difficult to find official sponsors for the venture.
We spent a lot of time trying to raise the capital for it, until finally it became obvious that who in the world is going to put their logo on the side of an airplane that's probably going to end up on network television in the middle of a fireball. And so then we went back to just nickels and dimes from fellow aviators that we could infect with the same dream we had.
Finally, in late 1984, the aircraft was completed. A state-of-the-art 2-passenger, 1-seat airplane named the Voyager. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Even Dick Rutan, who had been totally involved in all aspects of its construction, had a strong reaction.
I looked at that airplane and I thought, oh my goodness, look at that thing.
Using a modification of Burt's canard design, the Voyager featured a radical H-shape with outrigger booms and rudders. It had 2 engines, one in front and one in back. Both would be used for takeoffs, landings, and maneuvering where high power was needed. But to save fuel, only the rear engine would be used for sustaining in-flight power. Now, for the first time, Dick would pilot his brother's creation.
I think both of us had a deep respect for each of our disciplines. And he knew that I had a lot of confidence as a fighter pilot, and I think he had a lot of confidence in my ability.
Despite the skepticism of some onlookers and the extreme design features of the aircraft, on Dick's first test flight, the Voyager took gracefully to the air and flew. However, even for Dick, there were still moments of apprehension.
The wings could bend up and down. And I asked Burt one day, I says, how far could they bend before they break? And he says, well, they could go up 35 feet at the tip. This is from neutral, up 35 feet and down 35 feet before there would be a structural consideration. And I thought, structural consideration? And I didn't dare ask what that meant, but I did know one thing for sure. that if he was wrong about that, I knew who was going to find out about it first.
Voyager immediately began a long series of modifications and test flights. During one of these, disaster nearly struck when one of its propellers suddenly broke loose in flight.
Okay, what the hell is it? Prop, just take it easy. You're unstable. Shut your front engine down.
What is it?
The prop blade came off.
What one came off?
The front one. Shut the front down. You're okay. Stable.
Using his experienced piloting skills, Dick was able to land the Voyager safely. On the ground, the damage revealed just how close they had come. After repairs, the test flights continued, as did the ongoing efforts to keep the venture funded. One of their first public appearances was at the Oshkosh Air Show in Wisconsin.
Oshkosh was really important to us. The airplane really wasn't ready. It had those old clunky engines on it. But we needed the publicity, and we thought that it would be good to show it off when we flew into Oshkosh. And there was 200,000 or 300,000 people there to greet us and welcome us. And oh man, I tell you what, if I was ever discouraged before, that ended it. And that was quite a boost to the whole thing. And that's really what supported it. In fact, we got a letter someday, and we opened it up, and there was $2 in there. And the guy wrote on it, and he says, "This is $2. Don't laugh, because I didn't have lunch today." And that kind of epitomized how we raised the money for this thing.
The team ultimately received crucial assistance from the aviation community.
It was kind of like the magic door. We needed those engines, and Don Bigler from Continental called me up and says, "Hey, I think I got a neat engine for you." Or Ed King called, and he says, "I know what you're doing. I make radios." He says, "Anything I have, you can have." It was called the magic door. When we needed it, it seemed to open up, and it was there.
With the new engines and equipment, the test flights became more and more ambitious, culminating with a final world record non-stop closed-course flight lasting over 4 days. During this period, Dick and Gina were preparing themselves as well, undergoing rigorous training for the ordeal of skill and endurance that lay ahead. Gina even undertook Marine survival training with the United States Navy. By 1986, Dick, Gina, and Bert were finally ready to embark on the flight they had been dreaming of for nearly 6 years. Their historic, non-stop journey around the world was about to begin. December 13th, 1986. At Edwards Air Force Base, at the last minute, Dick decided to add even more fuel to Voyager.
It's going to take all night long to fuel the airplane on special scales, and there's a lot of things to do. We ended up putting 354 more pounds of fuel on board the airplane. He wasn't too happy about that. I did that just because of nothing more than a gut feel for what I thought this airplane could carry, based on nothing more that I'd been flying it for 2.5 years.
Due to early morning frost, portable de-icing equipment had to be used to clear the wings. Preparations for the round-the-world flight of Voyager were nearly complete. Finally, everything was ready. Dick and Gina strapped themselves into the phone booth-sized cockpit of the Voyager. As the supports were taken away, the wings, now fully loaded with fuel, were strained under the additional weight. The ground crew carefully moved Voyager into position for takeoff.
About 150 feet or so from the end of the runway. Yeah, it's loaded, all right.
Ready? We're ready to take off. Okay.
Clear to take off. Yeah, it's 8 o'clock, essentially. Okay, he's rolling, Mike. Let us know. Go ahead.
However, as Voyager began to roll down the runway, disaster threatened to end the mission before liftoff. Voyager had never been flown with all her fuel tanks full. Now, due to the massive weight within them, the wings began drooping dangerously.
Okay, 12, listen to her. I need to hear her. I need to hear 61 knots there. How are we doing? I need to hear her call. Wingtips in, we're low. Wingtips ready. Bring a stick back, Nick. Tell him to pull back on the stick. He's got a wingtip on the ground.
Fighting to control Voyager's dragging wings and straining to gain liftoff speed, Dick was running out of runway.
The airplane had this funny, hokey flying quality that would pitch up and down, and I couldn't control it. I reached up and grabbed the stick and started easing back. And I said to myself, Dick, if you've ever been smooth any time in your life, you better be smooth right now, because this is the big one.
He's got 3 knots and he's got 4,000 feet to go. And the wings come. She's gonna go. She's gonna go.
Slowly, the wings began to flex upward.
Come on, Dick. Whoa! 100 knots. Up there. We're going out in front. Woohoo!
At the last possible moment, Dick lifted Voyager into the air.
I don't believe it. Voyager is off.
Several inches of graphite composite skin were torn away from the foam core of each wingtip.
Move in and look at the right wing. Right winglet is failed.
After reaching a safe altitude, the brothers now had to assess whether Voyager's wingtip damage would jeopardize the flight.
He wanted to know the data of how the performance and stuff was going. We kind of talked about aborting, but I didn't really want to abort.
After consulting with Bert, Dick was able to free some of the loose pieces by performing a series of maneuvers that allowed the wind stream to tear them off. But the damaged wingtips still meant added drag, which would diminish Voyager's range.
I called Lynn Snellman, our weather guy. I says, Lynn, we got a problem with the wingtips. We're not going to have as much range as we had that we thought. If you can find me about 5 more knots of tailwind, I think we can still make it with the wingtips. And so we did.
The difficulties in simply getting airborne only reinforced how much could go wrong and what little margin the pilots had for error.
Now understand, here's an airplane that's so frail that if you hit any turbulence, the wings will come off, or you lose control of it. And there's no backup systems.
The fragile, lightweight design and construction of the aircraft meant that it was crucial to avoid bad weather.
Our weather people were vital. So they'd look from space and they'd see the thunderstorm, and they'd say, go around it to the north or to the south. Or there would be bands of weather that they could vector us through. And we had some excellent support that way, because they told us what the weather was going to be. And every 6 hours they refined our route to keep us in the best tailwinds and to keep us out of those horrible storms.
The problems inherent in obtaining permission to fly over foreign countries also determined Voyager's route.
I wanted to be over the ocean as much as possible. We took off from California and we flew all the way to Southeast Asia, the Philippines, south of Vietnam. And when we crossed the Malay Peninsula by Thailand, now we're in the Indian Ocean. Now we flew all the way across the Indian Ocean, just off the tip of India. And then we went feet dry for the first time of any country is Central Africa.
Over Africa, a friend flew up to meet them. After more than 5 days of isolation, it was a welcome sight. Battered by turbulence while constantly fighting tension and fatigue in the noisy and incredibly cramped interior of Voyager required steadfast concentration, skill, and endurance from the pilots.
There's no relaxing moment. So when you operate in that area, there's a couple things that happen to you physiologically. One is you have a hard time sleeping. Another thing is that the senses the body has naturally for thirst and hunger are almost totally suppressed. And when we crossed Central Africa, we came out in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, we go across the Atlantic Ocean, we stayed north of Brazil, south of Cuba, and then we crossed the isthmus just above Panama, and then back to California.
Then, nearing success on the 8th day of the flight, with the pilot still battling extreme tension and fatigue, a crisis struck.
It was right off the coast of Baja, California, and we ended up getting a big bubble of fuel in the feed line, and it got back to the back engine and the engine core. We're sitting in a little airplane that's so frail, like tissue paper, especially in the cockpit area. If we'd have touched down in the water, the airplane would have just disintegrated. It's too low to bail out. To do a night bailout, that was not a survival option either.
As several attempts to start both engines failed, Voyager sank ever closer towards disaster. And with hope nearly lost, the front engine suddenly sputtered to life.
And that old Continental engine came up to 2,800 RPM, just pulling its heart out. And so then we were lighter, and so I pulled the nose up to try to capture the climb speed, but I over-rotated. Pull the nose up, and about the time I'm pushing the nose back over again, the back engine roars to life.
With the crisis behind them, Bert decided to come up in a chase plane and rendezvous with Voyager as they flew over Southern California on the last leg of their journey.
It was nighttime join up, and he came. I could see their strobe light coming out, and he was looking, but he wasn't sure. All he could see was a strobe light. And he called and he says, "Hey, Dick, I think it's you. Why don't you turn your strobe light off just to verify that it's you?" And I reached up, and it turned it off. And Bert realized it was the Voyager, and he started crying. And he looked at it, and he was so emotional that he just started crying. He could hardly talk for a while.
As Dick and Gina neared their destination, they realized that history was in the making. Commercial airline pilots entering Los Angeles Air Control began to radio their congratulations and welcome homes.
Well done, mate. Welcome back. It's Delta 19. Well done, Voyager.
And when we finally got up over the hills and looked down and saw thousands of people lining the western dry lake and Media City up there, I thought, wow, for us? We decided with all those people that we'd fly around for a little bit longer. What I wanted to do is just tell them thanks. And we made a couple of low approaches right across the people that really made it possible.
After over 216 continuous hours in their confined aircraft, and with hardly any fuel left to spare, the weary pilots triumphantly touched down at Edwards Air Force Base at 8:06 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, December 23rd, 1987. Traveling at an average speed of 116 miles per hour, it had officially taken Voyager 9 days, 3 minutes, and 44 seconds to become the first aircraft to circumnavigate the globe nonstop without refueling. Numerous awards, citations, and special gifts of recognition were bestowed on Dick and Bert Rutan and Gina Yeager for their achievement. Meanwhile, their aircraft, Voyager, has secured a rightful place in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, near the reconstruction of the original Wright Flyer. In another parallel with the Wright brothers, the Rutans project was an entirely private endeavor.
I think the most significant part of it is that not so much what was done, was how it was done. Remember, this was done by citizens. It wasn't done by government. It wasn't done by big corporations. We were just 3 people in the desert with a dream and the freedom to go and do anything we wanted to, and we had the freedom to take a chance. Bert was amazed, and he told me later, he says, "Dick, it's a funny thing that I told you what the airplane, how it was going to be designed, and what it would do." And he says, "I was always amazed that you or nobody ever asked me to prove it mathematically." And it didn't even dawn on me. If my brother said that it could be done, I knew absolutely sure that it could be.
It was this same powerful sense of mutual respect and confidence that bonded the Wright brothers into such a formidable aeronautical team, allowing them to blaze the trail the Rutans and Gina Yeager so brilliantly extended. Along with countless other innovative aeronautical minds and adventurers around the world, they will continue working tirelessly to push mankind faster, higher, and farther than ever before.